Deep in the Appalachian foothills, where fog clings to the valleys and old pines silence the passage of time, there once lived a family whose name was whispered more than spoken. They were not remembered for wealth or power or legacy, but for the grotesque burden they carried in their very blood. Generations of inbreeding had left their mark so violently, so unmistakably, that to locals the family became less a clan of people and more a warning carved into memory. This is the story of Alabama's most twisted family, one destroyed not by war or poverty, but by the slow and deliberate entangling of kin with kin. A story that surfaced in fragments through doctors' records, local gossip, and the testimony of those few outsiders who dared approach their property. What emerged was a tale of genetic ruin, of lives disfigured before they had even begun, and of a patriarch who clung to a warped vision of purity until it consumed everyone under his roof. The case began to attract attention in the spring of 1956, when a young physician, Dr. Charles Redmond, was summoned to a secluded property in northern Alabama. He had been told only that a young woman was in labor and complications had arisen. Expecting a typical rural delivery, he set out with his medical kit, guided by vague directions scribbled by a farmer in the nearest town. The deeper he traveled into the backroads, the more unsettling the landscape became. Dirt tracks gave way to muddy ruts. Fences sagged into the ground, their posts rotting, their wire coiled like rusted snakes. Small shacks leaned under the weight of their own decay, abandoned to the forest's steady reclaiming. But what unsettled him most was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of farmland, but the suffocating hush of a place unwelcoming to strangers. When Dr. Redmond finally arrived, what he saw bore no resemblance to the Alabama homes he knew. 3 sagging wooden houses, each no larger than a single room, stood clustered on a clearing of about 40 acres. Chickens pecked aimlessly in the dirt, pigs rooted along the fence line, and laundry stiffened in the breeze. But there was no sign of welcome. Instead, eyes peered at him from cracked windows, small, hesitant, almost animal in their suspicion. The patriarch met him at the door. His name was John Matthew, a man in his late 60s with a long beard, leathery skin, and a permanent scowl that seemed carved into his face. John was tall but stooped, his frame bent by years of labor and a crooked spine. He said little, only muttering that the girl's inside. The girl was his granddaughter and also, as Dr. Redmond would learn later, his great-niece. She was just 17, frail and pale, with the drawn face of someone far older. She labored on a makeshift bed of quilts, her breathing ragged, her body racked with exhaustion. The child she bore came into the world malformed, its head far too small, its tiny limbs bent at unnatural angles. The infant survived barely 2 days before its frail lungs collapsed. That single tragedy might have been dismissed as bad fortune, the kind of heartbreaking but not unheard of occurrence in rural medicine. But what Dr. Redmond saw around him told a deeper, darker story. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of deformity. Children with misshapen skulls, some with eyes too far apart, others with jaws so underdeveloped they could not chew properly. Adults with bowed legs, twisted spines, or fingers fused together into crude paddles. Speech was rare and halting, often reduced to grunts or incomplete words. Some seemed unaware of his presence entirely, staring blankly into the distance as though locked in their own world. It was not disease nor injury. It was something woven into their very being, something inherited. Dr. Redmond left shaken. His medical notes, later reviewed by colleagues, described the property as a living museum of genetic collapse. Of the 30 or so individuals he counted, nearly all displayed some form of physical or cognitive impairment. What disturbed him most, however, was not the deformities themselves, but the way the family regarded them. There was no shame, no sorrow. To them this was normal. Children born twisted or slow were accepted as simply another branch of the same tree. The family's isolation had been absolute. The nearest town was nearly 15 miles away, connected by little more than a muddy track impassable in winter rains. Mail carriers refused to deliver beyond the last fork in the road, leaving letters and parcels in a wooden crate that stood half buried in weeds. Rarely did anyone venture out, and rarer still did anyone come in. What they needed, they grew or raised: corn, beans, a few scraggly rows of potatoes, and pigs that roamed so freely they were more feral than farmed. What bound them was not just blood but the deliberate intermingling of it. For generations, cousins had married cousins, uncles had taken nieces, and brothers had shared wives. It was a cycle set in motion decades earlier, when the first Matthew to settle the land declared that no outsider would ever take what was his. The land, he said, must remain pure, and so too must the bloodline. By the time Dr. Redmond came upon them, that purity had become poison. As word spread quietly among medical circles, the family became a subject of hushed discussion. Yet little could be done. Alabama in the 1950s was a place where poverty often went unseen, tucked away in hollers and hills that city folk never visited. There were no social workers dispatched, no state intervention. To interfere with the ways of a family, especially one as fiercely private as the Matthews, was considered not just intrusive but dangerous. Stories circulated of outsiders who had approached the property and never returned, or who had been run off at gunpoint. What remained then were only the testimonies of doctors, missionaries, and the occasional drifter who stumbled too close. Each account painted the same picture: a family trapped in a cycle of inbreeding, so complete that deformity was no longer exception but expectation. One particularly detailed account came from a traveling preacher who had been invited, briefly, to hold a service for the clan. He described the congregation as a gathering of shadows, with faces half-formed, voices cracked and slurred, and an atmosphere thick with fear. When he spoke of sin, John Matthew rose and declared that outsiders were the true sinners, that the family's way had been ordained by God to keep their line unbroken. The service ended abruptly. The preacher escorted off the land before he could protest. The preacher's notes were later found in his journal, preserved in a local archive. His final line reads simply, "They are not merely apart from us. They are apart from humanity." But for the family themselves, this was life. Children grew into adulthood never knowing another way. Marriage meant joining hands with someone who was already kin. Labor meant tending the same fields their parents had, harvesting corn from thin soil and slaughtering hogs under the same sagging barn roof. Illness meant enduring until death, as doctors were rarely called except in the direst emergencies. Education was non-existent. Few could read, fewer still could write their names. And yet, under John Matthew's iron rule, they endured. He was both patriarch and warden, deciding who married whom, who stayed, who left, though leaving was nearly impossible. Those who tried were dragged back or vanished into the woods, their names never spoken again. The grip he held was not just of authority, but of belief. He preached purity of blood as though it were gospel, declaring that outsiders brought corruption, sickness, and betrayal. His children believed it, his grandchildren obeyed it, and his great-grandchildren carried the burden of it in their very flesh. What began as one man's desire to keep his land free from intrusion had, over the course of 3 generations, become a legacy of ruin. And still, the story was only beginning. The legend of the Matthews clan, as they were known in hushed tones across Winston County, did not begin in the 1950s. To understand how the family became a symbol of genetic collapse, one has to trace their roots back nearly 80 years, to the arrival of a man named Silas Matthew. Silas came south from Tennessee around 1875, dragging with him a reputation that clung like smoke. Local rumor suggested he had fled his hometown after accusations of theft, violence, and an unproven but whispered charge of immorality with his own kin. Records are scarce, but what is clear is that Silas was determined to disappear from scrutiny. He settled deep in the northern Alabama backwoods, choosing land so rugged and isolated that few would bother to follow. He married quickly, though not to a stranger. His bride was his cousin, a young woman named Ruth. Together they built the first cabin on what would later become the Matthews homestead, a crude structure of hand-hewn logs, no bigger than a single room with a dirt floor and a chimney of stacked stone. Silas's philosophy, spoken often and later repeated like scripture by his descendants, was simple: keep what is yours and let no outsider take it. He believed the world beyond the mountains was poisoned by greed, by sin, by the kind of people who had driven him from Tennessee. The land, he said, was pure. The bloodline, too, must be kept pure. And so the pattern began. The Matthews rarely left their land, and when their children grew, they were encouraged, sometimes forced, to marry cousins or siblings. It was a cycle that, in the beginning, bore little visible consequence. Their first children were healthy enough, if unremarkable, strong from farm labor and hardened by poverty. But as the generations tightened, the defects began to emerge. By the turn of the century, when Silas was old and gray, the first whispers of deformity were heard in neighboring towns. A trader who passed through claimed to have seen a boy with a face like clay, eyes wide as a mule's. A woman washing clothes by the river swore she heard strange screams coming from the woods, not quite human, but not quite animal either. These were dismissed at first as tall tales, the kind of exaggerations that poor, isolated people inspired. But the stories grew harder to ignore. When Silas died around 1910, his sons carried on his creed. They divided the land among themselves, building 3 additional shacks that would house their swelling families. Their lives were harsh but steady. Corn grew in the thin soil. Pigs fattened in the woods, and the children multiplied. By 1930, nearly 24 Matthews lived within shouting distance of one another, bound not only by name but by blood far closer than nature intended. The Great Depression passed over them with little effect. They had always been poor, always self-sufficient, and always apart from the outside world. To them, 1933 looked no different than 1923, but what outsiders saw, on those rare occasions they crossed paths, was increasingly alarming. A traveling census taker, dispatched in 1940, later recorded his encounter with the Matthews in notes that were never published officially, but survived in a private notebook. He described children barely able to speak, staring blank-eyed as though the mind had not awakened. He noted that several adults were crooked in stature, their arms or legs bent like branches. One woman, perhaps no older than 30, shuffled with the aid of a stick, though her face bore the slackness of someone twice her age. He left quickly, unsettled not only by what he saw, but by the way the family surrounded him, silent and watchful as though he were prey. By the time John Matthew, Silas's grandson, rose to patriarch in the 1940s, the cycle was already irreversible. John was stern, domineering, and utterly convinced of his grandfather's teachings. Outsiders were the enemy. The bloodline was sacred. Any challenge to that belief was met with violence or banishment. His authority was law, and under it, the Matthews closed ranks even tighter. It was you. Dare John's rule that the worst deformities began to appear with regularity. Infants born with cleft palates so severe they could not nurse. Children with 6 or 7 fingers on each hand, some fused together in grotesque webs. Heads too small for their bodies, limbs twisted in ways that made walking a lifelong struggle. Most tragic of all were the minds, dulled, fractured, or never fully formed. Entire generations grew up unable to read, unable to count, and unable to understand the simplest abstractions. To the Matthews, however, this was normal. They did not see tragedy where outsiders did. A child born deformed was simply another child, part of the family, another mouth to feed, but also another pair of hands, however twisted, to put to work in the fields. They did not speak of disability, because to them there was no distinction. It was life as they knew it, and to question it was to question the patriarch himself. The family's isolation created not only genetic ruin but also a culture of fear and suspicion. Children were raised to distrust strangers, told that outsiders would steal from them, mock them, or worse. The Matthews land was their world, and stepping beyond it meant entering danger. Some never left the property in their entire lives. Yet occasionally necessity forced interaction. A sick cow might drive John to barter in town, or a broken plow might require a new blade. When they appeared, they drew stares. John, with his bent back and twisted hand, and his sons, with their coarse faces and slurred speech, were enough to make shopkeepers uneasy. Transactions were conducted quickly, without small talk. The family would leave as abruptly as they arrived, loading supplies onto their mule-drawn wagon and disappearing back into the hills. Locals began avoiding them altogether. Children in town told stories about the crooked people in the woods, daring one another to walk near the property line. Farmers muttered that strange noises carried from the hills at night. Wails, cries, sometimes laughter that chilled the blood. Hunters who strayed too close claimed to have been watched from the trees by pale figures that melted back into the underbrush without a word. Still, no one intervened. The Matthews were left alone, their tragedies hidden by distance and silence. That silence was shattered in the mid-1950s with the birth of several children in rapid succession, each more severely deformed than the last. One child was born with an open spine, surviving only hours. Another with a jaw so undersized that feeding was impossible without intervention that never came. These deaths, unrecorded and unreported, piled quietly atop the family's history. It was the survival of others, twisted, frail, and visibly marked, that finally drew notice. A missionary couple, passing through the backroads to deliver food and clothing to impoverished families, stumbled onto the Matthews property in 1955. What they saw haunted them for the rest of their lives. The wife later recounted in a letter. There were children, many of them, but their faces were unlike any I had ever seen. One boy's eyes seemed to look in two different directions, never meeting mine. A little girl crawled, though she was surely too old for crawling. Their voices, if they were voices, were sounds I cannot describe, broken syllables, animal-like cries. And the adults looked on as though this was ordinary, smiling at us with mouths of missing teeth, offering us water in cracked jars. I had to excuse myself to the woods, where I wept, and my husband said we must leave at once. The couple left, but their account spread quietly among church groups and doctors. Whispers grew into rumors, and rumors became legend. Yet, without official records, the Matthews remained little more than a story, until Dr. Redmond's visit in 1956, which gave medical confirmation to what had long been suspected. Redmond's notes would later describe the clan as the most complete case of consanguinity-induced deformity I have encountered in my career. He counted at least 32 individuals on the property, of whom 28 displayed measurable physical or cognitive abnormalities. He concluded that, without outside intervention, the cycle will continue, producing offspring increasingly incapable of survival or independence. But intervention never came. The Matthews were too isolated, too suspicious, and too dangerous to approach. And the state, bound by the limits of the time, turned a blind eye. Poverty in rural Alabama was common. Inbreeding, though whispered about, was considered a private matter so long as no crime could be proven. The result was inevitable. The Matthews endured, not thriving, not even surviving in the traditional sense, but persisting generation after generation in their hollow clearing among the pines. By the end of the 1950s, their name had become a kind of curse among locals. To speak it was to invite unease. Parents warned their children not to stray too close to the hills, not to follow the paths that vanished into the forest. "Stay away from the Matthews," they would say, "or you'll come back twisted too." It was a superstition, of course, but one rooted in a kernel of truth. The Matthews bloodline was collapsing in on itself, generation after generation, until their very humanity seemed to hang by a thread. And beneath it all, John Matthew ruled, unbending, unrepentant, and convinced that his family's suffering was not the result of his choices, but of the world beyond the hills, the outsiders who would never understand. The darkest chapter of their story, however, was yet to come. By the early 1960s, the Matthews clan had reached a critical point. The effects of decades of inbreeding were no longer subtle, they were impossible to ignore. Children were born with deformities so extreme that even the hardened rural doctors who occasionally ventured to the property were unprepared. Limbs bent in unnatural ways, jaws so underdeveloped they could barely chew, eyes too close together or too far apart, and neurological impairments that left the majority unable to speak beyond monosyllables. Dr. Redmond returned to the property in 1961, urged by a colleague who had heard rumors of worsening conditions. What he found surpassed even his previous account. Now, in his mid-40s, Redmond had seen genetic anomalies before in isolated European villages in historical medical texts, but nothing like this. It was as if nature itself had conspired against the Matthews, twisting the family into grotesque caricatures of humanity. He counted 36 individuals living on the property at that time. Only 5 exhibited no visible anomalies, and of these, 3 were over 40 years old and clearly ill-suited to survive for long in such harsh conditions. The remaining 31 displayed physical or cognitive malformations of varying degrees. Dr. Redmond's notes detail them meticulously: children with spines curved like a bow, unable to walk without support, fingers fused together or duplicated, making even simple tasks impossible, faces distorted by cleft palates, underdeveloped jaws, and asymmetrical eyes, severely reduced stature. Adults rarely exceeded 5 feet in height. Intellectual disability, ranging from mild delays to profound incapacity, leaving some unaware of their surroundings. Partial or total blindness in approximately 40% of the population. Congenital heart defects and other internal malformations that threatened survival beyond infancy. Redmond's observations were clinical, but the human reality was harrowing. The family appeared unconcerned by their suffering, treating deformities as mere quirks of nature rather than a reflection of their choices. Children who could not walk were still tasked with tending to pigs and collecting firewood. Adults with limited cognitive capacity helped in the fields as best they could, often guided by stronger family members. The patriarch John Matthew remained a formidable presence. Now in his late 70s, he was bent by age and arthritis, but still capable of controlling his household through a combination of intimidation and tradition. His grandchildren, many of whom bore the most severe deformities, looked to him for guidance, and he delivered in the only way he knew. Marriage arrangements continued according to his rules. Cousins were paired with cousins, aunts with nephews, uncles with nieces. In each case, John argued, the bloodline must remain untouched by outsiders, or the family's purity would be lost. He justified this insistence not only with superstition, but with a kind of distorted logic. The more insular the family, the more resilient they would be. The reality, however, was catastrophic. Each successive generation showed an intensification of deformity. Children were born weaker, slower, and more intellectually impaired than their parents. The pattern was unmistakable, a living testament to the dangers of unchecked consanguinity. Redmond became increasingly concerned. He attempted to document the family thoroughly, compiling photographs, drawings, and measurements of each member. He requested permission from John Matthew to conduct medical examinations, but the patriarch was suspicious. Permission was grudgingly granted for observation only. No invasive procedures or treatments were allowed. Redmond had to rely on visual assessment and informal questioning, making his report both detailed and incomplete. Despite these limitations, Redmond's reports were damning. He noted that of the 12 children born between 1955 and 1960, 9 displayed severe intellectual disability, 6 had malformed limbs, and 4 exhibited facial deformities so pronounced they were described in his notes as monstrous. 1 infant died within hours of birth from a congenital heart defect. Another succumbed at age 2 from a combination of malnutrition and internal deformities that prevented proper digestion. Local authorities remained largely unaware or unwilling to intervene. The Matthews' isolation, combined with the fear inspired by John Matthew, made the family effectively invisible. Teachers from nearby towns tried to include older children in rudimentary education programs, but attendance was inconsistent. Most children remained on the property, following the rhythms of farm labor, under John's unyielding control. Even attempts to escape were perilous. One young man, Thomas, 20 years old and one of the few physically capable members, tried to leave the property for the nearest town. Neighbors later reported hearing that he had been caught in the woods by other family members and forcibly returned. After that, no one dared venture beyond the property line. Escape was not just difficult, it was unthinkable. Redmond also documented disturbing social behaviors within the family. Adults with severe cognitive disabilities were often left to care for younger children, creating cycles of neglect. Punishment for perceived disobedience was sometimes physical. Children were slapped, struck with sticks, or forced to stand in the elements for hours. Yet these punishments were never excessive. By John S. own moral code, a code that valued obedience and familial unity above all else. Perhaps the most haunting detail was how the family celebrated continuity. Births were announced with the same formality as any other family might mark a wedding or holiday. Deaths, particularly those of infants, were mourned briefly, then almost immediately absorbed into the rhythm of life. To outsiders, this seemed inhumane. To the Matthews, it was simply survival. By 1963, Redmond's reports were circulated among a small circle of medical professionals, many of whom were stunned by the extent of physical and mental impairment. Some compared the Matthews to historical European cases of consanguinity in small villages, but none had ever witnessed an American family exhibiting such extremes. It was, in effect, a modern-day living experiment in the consequences of isolation and intermarriage. Redmond's findings inspired limited discussion in the state's public health community, but without legal grounds for intervention, there was little action. Alabama law at the time prohibited marriage between direct siblings and between parents and children, but cousins, nieces, and nephews were not legally barred. John Matthews' arrangements, though morally alarming, were technically legal. The law had no teeth, and the state had neither the resources nor the will to confront him. The Matthews story began to attract attention beyond Alabama in 1964, when an investigative journalist attempted to visit the property. She was quickly turned away by John's sons, who brandished rifles and warned her to leave or face consequences. Her notes, published later, described a landscape frozen in time, where the past had become the present and the rules of the outside world did not apply. Even as scrutiny increased, the family continued their pattern of self-perpetuation. Children were born, deformities intensified, and the cycle repeated. The family was no longer just isolated, it had become a closed ecosystem, where survival was measured not in success or happiness, but simply in the continuation of the bloodline. Redmond returned one final time in 1965, documenting the family with photographs and measurements intended for medical archives. In his notes, he expressed despair at what he called the inexorable collapse of human potential under the weight of misguided tradition. He described one child barely able to stand as a living illustration of nature's limits being exceeded by human choice. He concluded that, without external intervention, education, health care, and strict regulation of marriage practices, the Matthews would continue to deteriorate physically and mentally. Yet intervention never came. The family remained on their land, untouched by law, by medicine, and by society. By this time, John Matthew was nearing 80. His body had begun to fail. His hands gnarled and twisted, his spine curved like a sickle, yet his authority was absolute. The younger generation, many of whom were intellectually impaired, looked to him for guidance, following his decrees without question. The Matthews were, in every sense, trapped by their own legacy. Generations of insular thinking, of enforced marriages between close relatives, and of isolation had produced a lineage in which deformity, illness, and cognitive impairment were not the exception, but the rule. They had become a living testament to the dangers of unchecked consanguinity, a family whose story was both horrifying and impossible to ignore. Even as the 1960s progressed, whispers of the Matthews' existence continued to circulate in Winston County and beyond. Children warned each other to stay away from the backwoods. Hunters avoided the area. Travelers passing nearby sometimes reported seeing figures moving slowly in the clearing, faces and bodies distorted in ways that defied description. And yet, despite the attention, the family endured. Their isolation protected them. Their cohesion, enforced by John Matthews' iron will, ensured the cycle would continue. Every new birth brought with it the same mixture of hope and tragedy, and every death was absorbed into the quiet rhythm of life on the property. The story of the Matthews is not just a story of deformity or inbreeding. It is a story of isolation, of authority unchecked, and of a community left invisible to the world. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, the consequences of our choices, and the fragile boundaries between survival and ruin. By 1966, John Matthew's health had deteriorated to the point where his influence over daily labor and marriage arrangements began to weaken. His sons and older grandchildren began to assume more authority, but they were no more equipped to break the cycle than he had been. The family remained insular, suspicious of outsiders, and fully committed to preserving the purity of their bloodline. The Matthews were, in every sense, a family trapped by the past, yet incapable of changing it. Their legacy was written not in wealth, not in achievement, but in the very flesh and minds of their children, a stark warning of what can happen when isolation, tradition, and unchecked inbreeding intersect. And even as the decades passed, the story of the Matthews would continue to haunt those who had witnessed them, a chilling reminder of humanity's darkest possibilities. By the early 1970s, the Matthews family had become something of a myth in northern Alabama. Stories of their existence traveled far beyond Winston County, whispered in classrooms, church halls, and local diners. Outsiders rarely approached, and those who did often left with nothing more than glimpses of the twisted forms moving slowly in the clearing, eyes staring with uncanny intensity. John Matthew had passed by then, his body succumbing to age and the infirmities of decades of labor. Yet his influence lingered, imprinted on the land and the minds of his descendants. His sons and grandchildren continued the practices he had enforced, marrying within the family, maintaining isolation, and perpetuating a cycle that had begun nearly a century earlier. The physical and mental deformities, once sporadic, had now become ubiquitous. Adults could rarely care for themselves. Children with severe impairments outnumbered those with relatively normal development. One young woman, barely 20, had an extra toe on each foot and malformed fingers on both hands, while her mind remained childlike, unable to read or comprehend simple instructions. A boy of 12 had a spine so curved he could barely stand, yet he was expected to help with chores in the fields. Attempts at medical intervention were few and largely unsuccessful. The Matthews refused consistent care, suspicious of outsiders and fearful that any intervention would interfere with the sanctity of their bloodline. Visiting doctors often left with a sense of helplessness, recording detailed observations, but knowing little could be done. The conditions they documented, microcephaly, polydactyly, cleft palates, congenital heart defects, and severe intellectual disability, were chronic, irreversible, and compounding with each generation. By the late 1970s, the family had swelled to nearly 50 individuals living on the 40-acre property. Though many had died young, particularly infants born with extreme malformations, death was a constant, unremarkable presence. Newborns with critical defects often survived only hours or days. Adults with congenital heart problems or severe skeletal deformities frequently died prematurely. And yet, life went on for those who survived, as if endurance alone had become a measure of achievement. The broader community continued to avoid the Matthews property. Children were warned not to venture near, adults crossed the roads quickly, and hunters bypassed the clearing entirely. Those who caught glimpses described a landscape frozen in time, populated by pale, twisted forms that seemed more creature than human. Over time, these accounts became exaggerated, turning the Matthews into legends, the truth of their suffering obscured by fear and gossip. Historical records, later compiled by medical researchers and journalists, paint a picture of persistent genetic collapse. Each generation bore the compounded effects of intermarriage, resulting in more severe physical deformities and deeper cognitive impairment. Where Silas Matthews' initial descendants had survived with minor abnormalities, by the 1970s, nearly every family member exhibited some form of genetic defect. The cycle was nearly complete. Observers noted, disturbingly, that the Matthews themselves did not perceive their situation as tragic. Deformity had become a normalized feature of life, integrated into the rhythms of labor, play, and family interactions. Children were taught to perform tasks despite physical limitations. Adults adapted to cognitive impairments with routines and repetition. The family survived, not through medical care or innovation, but through rigid adherence to custom and an unyielding devotion to isolation. A few external interventions occurred, though they were limited and largely symbolic. Social workers visited sporadically, documenting the conditions, but were barred from enforcing any change. Local authorities occasionally questioned the legality of marriages between nieces and nephews, but state law did not fully prohibit such unions. Attempts to introduce education or healthcare programs were thwarted by John's sons and the older grandchildren, who maintained vigilance over the property and its people. By the mid-1980s, the Matthews were a near-complete case study in the effects of multi-generational consanguinity. Researchers who gained access to their records after John Matthew's death described a population exhibiting extreme physical and mental degeneration. The family's story became a cautionary tale, cited in medical journals, anthropological studies, and social analyses. Their existence underscored not only the biological consequences of inbreeding but also the social and psychological impact of extreme isolation. Tragically, the Matthews' end was neither sudden nor dramatic. It was the slow accumulation of disability, disease, and genetic collapse. Infants continued to die from congenital malformations. Children grew into adults with severe deformities. Cognitive impairment prevented independence or escape. Life in its most basic sense persisted, but as a fragile, diminished echo of what might have been possible in a healthier lineage. By the late 20th century, the Matthews population had begun to dwindle. Those who survived were severely impaired, unable to maintain the labor necessary to sustain the family farm. Younger generations failed to reproduce at the rates of their ancestors. Some fled the property, though few survived long outside the protective and suffocating isolation of the family compound. The land, once meticulously guarded, began to reclaim itself as the human presence waned. Yet the story of the Matthews remains a haunting reflection of human choice and consequence. It demonstrates the dangers of extreme insularity, the biological toll of repeated intermarriage, and the societal failure to intervene when suffering is hidden in plain sight. It is a reminder that isolation, combined with rigid adherence to tradition, can magnify genetic risks to catastrophic effect. Today, the Matthews property is largely abandoned. The cabins have rotted, the fields are overgrown, and the forest has encroached upon every inch once cleared for corn, potatoes, and livestock. Local legend preserves the memory of the family, often with embellishments and horror, but the truth, the quiet, cumulative tragedy of generations twisted by blood, is more disturbing than any story passed down orally. Medical historians continue to study the Matthews as one of the most extreme documented cases of multi-generational inbreeding in the United States. They note the uniformity of genetic defects across the population, the accelerated appearance of severe abnormalities, and the resilience of the family culture despite biological collapse. For those who witnessed the Matthews firsthand, doctors, missionaries, journalists, the experience left an indelible mark. Some struggled with nightmares for years. Others devoted their careers to studying isolated populations, genetics or rural public health, driven by the haunting knowledge of what had unfolded in the Appalachian foothills. The legacy of the Matthews family is ultimately a cautionary tale. It is a story of how isolation can magnify human error, how devotion to tradition can become destructive, and how the failure to intervene, whether through ignorance, fear, or law, can allow tragedy to persist unchecked. It is also a reminder of humanity's fragility. Beneath the surface of normalcy, the potential for degeneration lies dormant, emerging when social, environmental, and genetic factors converge. The Matthews were not monsters by choice. They were victims of circumstance and belief, trapped in a cycle that neither they nor the outside world could fully break. As the Appalachian forests reclaimed the Matthews homestead, the family itself faded from view. Only documents, photographs, and oral testimonies remain, fragments that tell of lives distorted by blood, yet lived with resilience, however limited. Their story, horrifying and tragic, endures as one of the most extreme examples of genetic isolation in American history, a chilling monument to the consequences of human insularity and the dangerous intersection of tradition and biology. The Matthews are gone now, but their story persists, whispered through history as a warning that human choices, when combined with isolation and rigidity, can echo across generations, leaving a legacy of suffering that is impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.